The history of Universalism is a history of persecution. For the last 1,500 years, we've been persecuted and discredited by mainstream Christians in a variety of different ways. And I've been thinking a lot about, especially as a younger person myself, being Generation Z, I've been thinking a lot about how exactly will the devil, what lie will he spread to discredit and to fight against the true gospel in this generation, in this day, in this age. And I think the biggest lie the devil will use to keep people from becoming universalists and to fight against the victorious gospel in our generation will be the lie that universalists are inherently very progressive and very liberal. There's a very common stereotype out there that universalists don't take the Bible very seriously, that we think it's a book filled with errors, that we believe all religions lead to God, that we don't believe in hell at all, and all these other stereotypes about universalists that we're just either New Agers or progressive Christians or both. And there's all these terrible stereotypes about universalists out there. And I think this would be the biggest hurdle for universalists in this generation, because Christianity in America, at least, and I know this is true of the West more generally, but especially America, is moving in a more conservative direction. They call it the trad or the traditionalist movement. The reason is that as our society has become more secular and more progressive, Christianity has, really entered into a new crisis, losing all these people. And a lot of the people that are becoming interested in Christianity are becoming interested in the more devout forms of it. And they're becoming more interested in the more conservative forms of it, because the more conservative Christians typically are the more devout and the more serious Christians. So a lot of people are becoming interested in very conservative Christianity. And I think it's a good thing that people are becoming interested in Christianity. I think it's wonderful to hear stories of all these people, especially young men, coming up out of either atheist or agnostic or even lukewarm Christian households, and are starting to get very serious about their faith in Christ and get very serious about their faith in studying and learning. And I think that's all very wonderful. But one of the downsides of people getting very interested in very conservative theology, and I don't think universalism is liberal. In fact, I actually think it's the fullest expression of orthodoxy. But getting more interested in these conservative theologies is that the idea of eternal hell is gaining popularity with them. And if universalists are portrayed as liberal, they will increasingly be seen as compromisers and trying to liberalize Christianity and to make Christianity more like the very secular and very progressive culture we live in today. And this is a serious problem for Christians. And I do think this, Christian Universalists, I do think this is going to get much worse for us, because Christianity is going to move inside a more conservative direction. I think the best example I can think of is the Catholic Church. Right now, the Catholic Church in America is more moderate to even left-wing, but all the young Catholics in America, all the ones that are very serious, the ones that are going to go on and be leaders inside the church and have real influence, are all very conservative. They're all, very conservative young Catholic men, and they're going to move the church inside a more conservative direction. Then I think the influence of the global South inside the church, I think we'll probably have an African pope at some point in this century, but I think the Catholic Church in America will become more and more conservative over the next 50 years, and one of the side effects of that will be more conservative theologies about hell. And I think that's true of the Orthodox Church. I think that's true of various Protestant churches. I think that we will see a massive rise in more conservative theology about hell. And Universalists will be portrayed as inherently liberal. And a lot of people, because people are getting increasingly sectarian, will increasingly think they won't even consider Universalism as an option, because they'll be like, oh, universalism is liberal, it's far out, they don't take the Bible seriously, they don't take the faith seriously, and they won't even consider universalism. And I think that will keep thousands of people, maybe millions of people, from even considering universalism, because they'll be convinced that universalism is inherently liberal and inherently progressive and inherently unchristian, and they won't even consider us as a serious school of Christian thought. And I think that's the greatest problem for universalists going forward. So what do I think can be done to remedy this, to stop this? Well, I think honestly, the reason I started the channel is so that I could preach more biblical universalism to, at least do my part to break this stereotype that universalists are inherently liberal and that we have no good biblical reasons or, reasons inside tradition to believe what we believe. And, that's what I've done. And I think the best thing universalists can do is get more educated about our faith, to understand, you've got to understand the enemy's opposition better than they understand themselves. I'm not saying that other Christians are an enemy. You've got to understand the opponent's, arguments better than they understand them, and you need to point out the flaws within them. And I think definitely the first thing universalists can do is get very educated on our faith, study your faith, understand why you believe what you believe. Then I think the other thing we can do is get involved inside our local church. I've talked about this many times before on the channel, but there are a bunch of moderate churches, mainline churches, particularly the old mainline Protestant churches. And there's I've even made a map of Universalist churches throughout America. I have 2 videos on this. I have churches for Christian Universalists and top 11 denominations for Universalists if you're interested. But I've talked before that we need to get involved inside our local churches, and there's a lot of churches that are moderate, lukewarm. And what you can do is get involved inside a church that's not oversold on the idea of eternal hell, and you can, preach the true gospel and influence that church to move inside a more biblical universalist direction, or at the very least keep it from moving into an eternal damnation view. And I think that's really the first step we can take. I think that can definitely go a long way, getting involved in our local churches, getting involved with our local community, and honestly just be very open about your faith. Like, for instance, unless I'm around fundamentalists, when people ask me my religious beliefs, I'll just outright tell them I'm a Universalist, identifying with the Universalist Church of America, and I'll explain to them what that means. They'll be, what's that? And I'll explain to them the gist of what it means, and I just do that now. And I'm very open about my faith with folks. People ask me about my faith, and I'll talk to them about it. And I'm a strong believer you can be a missionary anywhere, any place, anytime. And I do that in my own daily life. And I've talked before about other things, for instance, like Bible tracts. I think Bible tracts, Universalist Bible tracts have a lot of potential, because a Bible tract, you can leave it anywhere. For instance, like you can maybe, I don't know, leave a Bible tract on a gas pump. Somebody put it in their pocket because, I don't know, it looked kind of interesting. And maybe they'll use it as a bookmark or something. And maybe somebody later down the road might read it, Same with Bible tracts, you can pretty much leave them anywhere and anybody could get their hands on them. And I do think there's a lot of potential with making homemade Universalist Bible tracts. I think there's a lot of potential with that. Honestly, a while back ago, I was writing Love Unrelenting documentary. Love Unrelenting, great Universalist YouTube channel. He made a documentary about Christian Universalism, really good. And for a while, I was just putting Love Unrelenting documentary, writing it in pen, on the back of $20 bills, and I was just using that at gas pumps. And I was doing that for a while when I was mostly paying for my gas in cash. But I was just doing that. I mean, you can be very creative with how you spread your faith. And I just think there's so much we can do to spread our faith as Universalists, and there's so many different ways to preach the gospel. And I run a YouTube channel. I barely know anything about technology. I'm probably the most technologically illiterate Gen Z person you'll ever meet. But I started a YouTube channel, though I'm not terribly technologically literate. And but I know how to yap, and I started a YouTube channel, and I make videos now about Universalism. So there's a lot of different things you can do to spread the gospel. Just, be imaginative, really. There's so many different things you can do to spread the gospel. And I really do believe every person counts. I think that if you've come to the truth of universal salvation in Jesus Christ, that's by the grace of God. And I think that God has a purpose for you. He wants you to spread the gospel with others, because there's so few people that know the good news that Jesus is not just the Savior of the few, but He's the Savior of all. And I really do think that if you're a Universalist listening, that you've been given a blessing by God, and that you need to spread that with other people. Even if they don't listen, you should at least try. And that's something I'm a very strong believer in. So a large part of this channel is encouraging fellow Universalists to be evangelists, to evangelize to their local churches, to evangelize to the local community, to evangelize the family and friends. I'm all about evangelism, and I think that's really the best thing we can do is get educated in our faith, understand why we believe what we believe, and then talk with other people about it. And I think that's really the best thing we can do as individuals. Now, I do think that really what has to be done is the reestablishment of the Universalist Church. I've talked about this before. In the 19th century, Universalists had a place in America because we had a denomination. When we had a denomination, we had a church in every major city in America and all sorts of small towns. So that was a Universalist presence that way. We had a Universalist presence with our seminaries. For instance, Universalists, we had circuit riders. They would go around and they preach the gospel all across, the country. An evangelist. Universalists had, I've talked about the seminaries, so we could educate Universalist ministers. Universalists had a bunch of literature. For instance, a lot of people, though they could not find a Universalist church, would still become Universalists by newspapers, and they would, you know, you get a Universalist newspaper, and that way they would still have some, connection with their faith. And Universalists did a lot of writing. In fact, you can still find a bunch of Universalist books online, free to read, free of charge, a bunch of old Universalist books from the 19th century. Because the Universalists had a very strong literature scene. We were writing a bunch of books, we had a bunch of newspapers, and that was a way that we were able to reach people. And we also were able to do missions to other countries. I've talked about our mission to Japan, talked about our mission to Scotland. And when the Universalists had a denomination, people knew who we were because people would know, oh yeah, the Universalists, they're that church that believes in universal salvation. People knew who we were because, we had a place in America. We were, I've done the math. I think in size, if you factor in the size of the American population then and now, we were about the same size as the disciples of Christ are today. So like people kind of know who the disciples of Christ are, but the Universalists, we hit above our weight because everybody kind of is like, oh yeah, those are the people who don't believe in eternal damnation. The joke was that our church bells, they would ring no hell, no hell, no hell. That's what I would say when they ring. That was the joke. And we did a lot of good. In fact, Universalists, we were able to move up the social ladder a bit. That we had Universalists started out as just poor farmers, but because we had a denomination of real influence, we eventually had bankers and influential people. I've talked about P.T. Barnum was a Universalist. I think Florence Nightingale was a Universalist. Was it Florence Nightingale was the other girl? It's not Florence Nightingale. My memory has slipped at the moment, but I believe the woman who started the American Red Cross was a Universalist. Was it Betsy Ross? No, it's not Betsy Ross. Forgive me. My memory is completely slipping. I know Betsy Ross is the lady who made the first American flag. So forgive me for blanking out there. But, there were famous Universalists in the 19th century, and we had real influence because we had a denomination. And I think that having a denomination or some sort of institution that spreads Universalism is incredibly important. Organizations, I don't know, the Christian Universalist Association is a thing. I think it has a lot of problems. At the very least, I think it needs to adopt the Winchester Profession as its statement of faith. But it's a step in the right direction. And I do think that we should work together as Universalists and form organizations and things to spread Universalism. I think that Universalists should work in pre-existing denominations, but also should be church planting as well, planting new Universalist churches. I think that if we revitalize old churches by engrafting biblical Universalist ideas within them, and also found new congregations with biblical Universalist foundations, I think that we can go a very long way. So I do think that that's really the ultimate thing that has to be done, is the establishment of something like the old Universalist Church, and an institution that can educate people and raise people inside a biblical Universalist faith and spread it to others. I think that's ultimately what is necessary. I think this is a problem that an individual cannot solve by themselves. I think this is something that has to be done. We had to form some sort of greater institution to spread biblical Universalism, but we had to remember that God is on our side, and we need to pray and fast. I think that's another very important thing we can do, is pray and fast for the victorious gospel. But I'm a strong believer that if you are a Universalist listening, that God has blessed you, and that you should, in some way, shape, or form, be a missionary for your beliefs. At the very least, I think that's what can be done to stop this idea that Universalism is inherently liberal, and to hopefully spread the gospel. But it's going to be very hard. I've watched trad material. I've listened to trad material, and it is. I hear so many of these horrible stereotypes. The one that probably disappoints me the most is Redeemed Zoomer, because he's very clearly a very smart guy, and he knows a lot about different Christian denominations. But when I listen to him talk about Universalism, it's very clear that he hasn't done 15 minutes of research on us, which is very depressing. It's like, what do you have to lose? And I think apart from the perception that Universalists are liberal, I think the other thing that's going to keep us, especially as society becomes more secular and Christianity becomes more close-knit, is losing it all. Because, a lot of people, they're going to lose everything if they become a Universalist. I think of the Reverend John Murray, when he became a Universalist, because he had fallen on hard times before. His friends had given him money and gifts kind of to help him get through. But when he became a Universalist, all of a sudden the money and the gifts his friends gave him became debt, and he ended up serving some time in debtor's prison. And I do think that people will lose. I do think that one thing also that will keep people from becoming Universalist, apart from the perception of being liberal, is the fear of losing friends, losing family, losing the community they have. Because being a Universalist is honestly, it's very lonely. because there's so few of us really. It's a very lonely faith to practice because there's so few people that really know the truth. Of course, every now and then some people do get lucky and are able to find a congregation that does preach the truth, but it is a very lonely faith. I'm very much reminded. I was combing through the internet one time when I was doing research for my Churches for Christian Universalist video, and actually I found like a conversation from like 2005 on some app somewhere between Universalists, and I can remember reading one person say that I'm just done hiding, and they said they went to evangelical churches, and they said that I'm just going to be open with my beliefs. I'm just going to talk publicly about what I believe, and I don't care anymore. And I think that's really kind of just the attitude Universalists should have. We just shouldn't care. We had to remember that if people persecute us for what we believe, that there is a much greater reward in heaven. For all the times people hate us, we are. I remember what Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount. Woe to woe to you if men love you and praise you, because they did the same thing, the false prophets, and you know and blessed are you if you're mocked for my name, the Son of Man's sake. Your reward's great in heaven. I'm paraphrasing very heavily there, but that's what Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount. We have to remember that we are blessed in our persecution, and the only person's opinion that really matters of us is the Lord Jesus Christ. So that's kind of what I think is the biggest problem for universalism going forward, and those are some of my proposals to help remedy the problem. Well, y'all have a good day. God bless. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Share, and Christ will conquer.